In today's session, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Barbara Covarrubias Venegas, a colleague from the Diversity, Inclusion and Equity Group, with whom I collaborated in Benalmedina last autumn. Barbara is the founder and CEO of Collabify, the collaboration company. She's an L&D professional, keynote speaker, and workshop designer based in Valencia, Spain. With more than 15 years of experience in organisational and leadership development across international contexts, she holds a doctoral degree from Universität Klagenfurt and combines applied research with hands-on work in organisations. The focus areas are positive leadership, learning culture, hybrid and virtual collaboration, and inclusive workplace structures. Barbara works in English, German, and Argentine Spanish and has facilitated programs and keynotes across Europe, Latin America, and the United States. Barbara, welcome. You're a very busy woman.
Thank you so much, Vincent. It's fantastic, particularly to see how many great connections grew out of the Academy for Diversity and Innovation conference last year. Happy to be here.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure. Just if you could start off by telling us a little bit about your early life. Where were you born? What was it like?
I was born and grew up in the south of Austria, so bordering country to Italy and Slovenia. And I lived in the countryside most part of my life so far, which means a very sporty environment, lots of winter, lots of summer sport, a very sporty family. But when I went to university, I figured out that I would love to explore bigger environments. And that is when I started my journey to move across countries. I became an exchange student in Italy, in Milano. Then I moved to Barcelona for a summer to work there. I did another exchange semester in Chile. And then I did my internship in Mexico. And this is when all the international and diverse sort of flavor and beauty came into my life. I finished studying, and well, this is when I moved to Chile and at some point moved back to Austria, and now I'm living in Spain.
Okay, now, interestingly, I've been to, well, 30 years ago, I was in Chile and Mexico. What were you doing in Chile and Mexico? Where were you living in those places?
In Chile, I was living in Valparaíso, Valparaíso, mi amor. I
Mhm.
loved it, truly enjoyed it. Never lived and only saw another city very similar to Valparaíso, which is a very special city. It's Portugal, Lisbon. I never felt and lived in anything similar. So a special city in the in the hills with a a very special environment, I must say. And in Mexico, I was living in a very big city, and you can imagine this was a huge change again. And I must also admit that I knew by then that this was slightly too much for me. This is also when I moved back to Austria and landed in Vienna for a long part of my career.
Yeah. Now, where were you in Mexico?
In Mexico, I was in Mexico City and I was working for the Embassy of Austria for the commercial delegation.
I see. Okay. What were your hobbies and interests as a young woman?
I did a lot of horseback riding. I even had my own horse. But when I started my international moves, this was the moment when I decided to sell my horse and sort of try to be slightly more independent. And something else that I was doing, and I'm still doing a lot, is I'm a very avid reader. I love reading and learning through reading, but also I became a huge podcast listener in the past 5 years, I would say.
Okay. No, no. You we've planned to talk about inclusive facilitation and inclusive meetings. So, what do you think the big issues with those are? You mentioned to me that meetings are not neutral. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Oh, yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Again, Vince, you know, meetings are not neutral because very often, meetings are not designed nor facilitated intentionally. So, what we very often see is power structures or decision-making power is coming through in meetings, which, of course, to some extent, doesn't allow everybody to participate the way they want to. Besides that, we have read and heard a lot about cognitive diversity in the past years, particularly in the field of diversity, and knowing that not everybody has the same level of extraversion or pulling him herself into a discussion, we must understand that designing and facilitating for inclusion must be on top of the agenda of every organization if we want to make every voice count.
Okay, now we've discussed inclusion starts before the meeting, not by inviting more people. And what specifically do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed. What we have seen in the pandemic, particularly in online meeting, the online meeting space, is that we try to invite everybody to the meetings because we want people to feel that they belong, that the company is there for them, and all the team members are there. But what we also saw is that we became all aware of what meeting fatigue means, and we also became aware of how damaging too many meetings can be for team culture. So, by inviting more people to a meeting, very often we even have the contrary effect of building an inclusive workplace because the more people, it's not always the merrier, particularly not for those people who do not necessarily thrive in big groups, particularly if it is not designed or facilitated for not so loud voices to shine in those environments.
Yeah, now, I'm a trainer. I work with big groups, small groups, and I see what you mean about, especially in big groups, the noisy ones get noisier and the quiet ones get quieter. But if you don't invite them in the first place, how are they going to develop to find their voice?
I'm not saying that you should not invite them to the meetings. I'm saying that we need to be conscious about how many people are in a meeting because the more is not the merrier. We have more decision points and things get just overcomplicated. And nobody has an ROI from being in a meeting where they don't belong for whatever reason that is, whether I'm not involved in that project enough, whether I'm just marginally sort of touching on the topic or whatever. So what I want to advocate for is that by using synchronous but also asynchronous ways of asking for input that really is valued by whoever is organizing the meeting, this is how we bring the voices to the table. And if we have, for example, people in a meeting that we do know that there are a lot of people out there who just don't feel comfortable open up and speaking to big mic, let's say like this, right, in front of a bigger group. And there are many facilitation techniques like think, pair, share, or liberating structures, one, two, four, all, that help that those lower voices even get amplified by the louder voices. And I don't think that necessarily everybody needs to learn to speak up in front of a big group because maybe there are other ways that people can contribute if they just don't feel comfortable and they don't want to speak in front of bigger groups.
Okay, I see. Okay, so you mentioned Amy Edmondson's research in terms of psychological safety. Um, is it the foundation that everything else rests on?
I believe that research, groundbreaking research from Amy Edmondson about psychological safety helps us all to create inclusive workplaces that allow for high performing teams and allow for people to speak up even though they might not be as confident as others may be. So this is one thing. But on the other hand, I would also always point out there's a lot about design, techniques, facilitation methods, moderation and presentation stuff that is not necessarily built on Amy Edmondson's psychological safety research.
Now, could you tell us a little bit about your doctoral research, changing age and career concepts in the Austrian banking industry? That sounds interesting.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. I had three research areas when I was a researcher in Austria. So I was leading on one hand a research team, and we were looking at how HR competencies and HR role models were changing over the years, like the past 20 years. And we developed a competency model that, of course, nowadays is already it's changing, it's ever changing. The second research project that I was very much involved in, that also had where also my PhD belonged to, was about inclusive workplaces, where I looked into how age and gender stereotypes influence careers of managers and non-managers in the Austrian banking industry. And what I was doing is I was doing a qualitative study comparing how men and women perceive that those stereotypes influence. And what we do still see, so my research and the data collection was done in the years 2017, 2016 and 2017. And I handed the PhD in 2018. And what the maybe not surprising, more depressing result probably is that in terms of how women and aging women are valued in the workplace is still very much back to what happened in the 1980s. Maybe it somehow got better, but at the end, what we do see is that women suffer a triple jeopardy effect, which is the moment that they're getting older and the moment that they're also, of course, women. It's a triple jeopardy effect for their careers.
See. Okay. Now, you mentioned these these incidents. Have you seen this specifically in your field of expertise?
What do you mean with incidents?
Sorry, what we've just been talking about. So the double jeopardy thing. Have you seen it in your office? Have you seen it, in your groups that you facilitate?
Absolutely. We do also know, and I just would love to tie now my PhD also to what we are talking about, inclusive facilitation previously. So we do also see that women, for example, on average, speak up less in meetings. And this has several reasons. Maybe women are less confident, maybe women feel less confidence, maybe women feel more pressure. There's a lot of research out there on that. But also taking this into consideration, it means that the moment we don't speak up as often in meetings, we might get overlooked when it comes to career progression. And again, building up on this and coming back to what I mentioned earlier, it is about us as meeting designers or as experienced designers, as managers, to be aware of who is and who is not speaking up, and making sure that through whatever channel necessary, people can participate in meetings with their opinions. And that also means not only me, giving Barbara the possibility to use the chat to contribute to the meeting decision making or whatever, or using a polling tool, for example. It also means that we need to structure ourselves better when we design meetings, and, for example, asynchronously send out enough material beforehand so that people have the possibility to prepare properly. That means that those who might feel overwhelmed having to process a lot of information in a meeting have the chance to prepare properly beforehand, and then feel more confident to contribute and or speak up. Still, as meeting designers, this is one thing is design. On the other hand, we have again facilitation technique. As I mentioned before, we talk about think, pair, share. It's a very well-known facilitation technique, right? Very often we don't think, and now tying this also to cognitive diversity, we don't think enough that not everybody processes information at the same speed. This means that by allowing people some thinking time before taking decision, like, okay, this is what is happening. I'm giving you now a minute to think about that, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depending on the complexity, of course, of the issue. Then I'm going to pair you with another colleague, team member, somebody from another department into a pairing situation. Think, pair. And then when we come back, we are sharing. That helps a lot also to have that louder voices amplify the lower voices, or other people speak up, or maybe people who don't feel as confident previously feel more confident to speak up.
Now, you've been involved in this field of work now for about 15 years. So what would you say are the major steps forward that you've seen?
In which field exactly?
Diversity, inclusion, equality.
Okay. I I understand that one of the biggest changes that is happening in what I see with my client organizations, it is a more data-driven approach, which in general I do see occurring in HR, L&D, and the DEIB field. So a more data-driven approach, which of course me with my researcher evidence-based heart makes me super happy, right? Because we do know that the moment that we use data to drive business decision or decision making, we base our decision on a solid foundation. And I think this is one thing that was happening in the past 10 years. Another thing that is recently happening, I also do believe that I see less, that I see in my work at least, more requests coming into other areas about other topics than I had, for example, 5 or 6 years ago. So I see like the diversity field in in my context is very often somehow embedded into other areas, which can be good and can be bad, right? So on one hand, I think it is very good that the thought of DIB inclusive workplaces is embedded in other programs. For example, in my communication training, in my collaboration training, in my leadership trainings. But I do see, for example, less requests about unconscious bias or diversity training for managers, something like that. So this is the second issue that I see happening.
Okay, now you're living in Valencia in Spain, which is sort of southern Mediterranean. Generally, you're from Austria. Would you say there's a significant difference between what's happening in, more Northern Europe than Southern Europe?
In the DIB field in corporate context, you mean, right? Um, yes and no. I think that if I look at my clients, and also here again, just a word of caution, my main clients are outside of Spain, but of course, I'm part of the discussion of DEIB in Spain as well. But my main clients are Central European multinationals, I would say. And I think it depends a lot, particularly if I look at my context in Valencia. There is maybe not so much discussion on DEIB, but also this is sometimes because of company size, right? But again, this is a little bit my context and the companies that I mainly work with.
Okay. Well, like I said, I think that's the big issue. Our daily work, the way we work, what we observe, how we try to manage things to get better outcomes for our clients and things like that. So how do you see the future of diversity, inclusion, and equality? What major changes are still required to facilitate change?
I think the direction as a researcher, again, what I truly love seeing in the field is this data-driven approach because this is the way and the possibility to get our topics on the agenda of CEOs, CFOs, etc. Because the moment that we are able to show the impact of our initiatives, the moment it will be easier to get also positive sign off on our initiatives, right? So I think the data-driven pillar is something absolutely fundamental. I also strongly believe that any kind of organization should have a duty somehow to build more inclusive workplaces. And I'm speaking now about diversity in general, because for whatever reason, people have always been excluded from certain contexts. And I think this is not I think, we do know that this is damaging to companies, it's damaging to societies, and it's also damaging on a more micro level, like families and so on. So I think this is a major change that I would love see happening more in organizations, which has been somehow facilitated if we think about sustainable development goals, right? Because inclusiveness is part of the SDG movement and somehow got more into the agenda of what is happening in companies as well through that terminology or through that field.
Okay. Now, could I ask you a personal question? Have you or your family ever felt that sensation of exclusion, where you wanted to be at the heart of things, but maybe you weren't given those opportunities?
I wouldn't say that it was because I didn't feel being at the heart of things. But for example, here in Valencia and in Spain, there are five official languages in Spain, right? In Valencia, we have two official languages, which is Castellano, the Spanish, the common Spanish, but we also have Valenciano. And Valenciano for me is sometimes easy to understand because I have a solid foundation in Roman languages, but I don't understand everything. And I cannot talk, I cannot speak in Valenciano. I can read it probably, but I'm not understanding in a full conversation everything. And I'm not even sure if I'm properly reading it, right? Some words are totally different. Some words are similar to Italian or French or whatever, or Portuguese. And we had discussion, I think, 1.5 years ago, because in our family group of my son's kindergarten, they suddenly switched from one academic year because of it was a voting issue within the school system, the public school system here in Valencia. They switched to Valenciano, and I felt like this was really difficult for me because I had to start translating some of the messages to be really 100% sure of what was going on with Google Translate, which I wasn't sure because sometimes Google Translate or whatever AI tool you're using takes Catalan, and Catalan is slightly different and so on. And when I was talking to the mom who is like in charge of that group, to say so, she was explaining that it was the reason because of this public voting regarding official languages in public kindergartens here in Valencia. That's why she switched languages. But she was totally fine with using from then onwards on a bilingual approach, which of course at some point I felt bad about because I think I'm probably one of the only ones that she needs to do that for and is an extra work for her voluntary position. But anyways, I think this is one of the most recent situations that I remember that I did not feel as included as I could be if we would do everything in Spanish.
Okay, on a similar point. Now, I saw you in Benalmedina in the autumn last year, and I saw you on stage, and I thought you were amazing. Absolutely. In fact, there were some great speakers, I thought. And I know you speak English, German, and Spanish. Where do you get the confidence for all those women out there who don't have that confidence? Where do you get that confidence to get up there and really, give it your all? I thought it was phenomenal.
Thanks a lot. Deeply appreciated. At the end, it's the three P's, right? Practice, practice, and practice. And I just listened today to a podcast, and Shadi Sarai talked about the imposter syndrome, which indeed was when they found out about imposter phenomenon in the 70s, 80s. It was called a phenomenon because it's not a syndrome. Syndrome makes it like sound like an illness and something really horrible, something you cannot get rid of, right? But at the end, imposter phenomenon, which I truly love this reframing for myself as well, happens to everybody, and nobody can not have it at some point or the other in their professional lives, careers, or private lives, whatever it is. But I also do know that I became a great speaker because I invested in myself. I had people to believe in myself. Yes, I had people push me for that, but also I took my own development in that area very seriously. And you can say now, well, yes, I come from a middle class Austrian family, so I was advantaged to be able to have some savings. I was always working, but still I'm coming from a well-settled middle background. But there is, particularly nowadays, there is so much out there where we can learn from with just having access to the internet. Of course, this again, we need to have access to a cell phone, a nice, a quiet spot, and so on. I'm totally aware of all the privileges that we have. But I believe that there is so much out there that we can learn from, that if you yourself have what in theory we call self-directed learning, which means you need to have the self-organization, the self-motivation, and those skills to really pull through, and also to some extent the confidence that you can manage that. And also this again, from a researcher background, this to some extent is influenced by your upbringing, your context, your team members, but it's also something that you can develop yourself.
Okay, Barbara, that's all we've got time for today. Can I say a huge thank you on behalf of all the viewers? It's been a great pleasure talking to you again. Could you just hold on for 2 minutes so I can thank you personally, and I'll see you on the other side. Thanks
Absolutely.
very much.
Thanks so much.